the Better Futures Forum stream for Scope 3 emissions. My name's Tennant Reid of the Australian Industry Group. I'm going to be moderating the panel discussion today. I've been advising Australian Industry Group, a major industry association in Australia, on climate and energy policy for more than a decade. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting today and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and encourage all of you to let us know in the chat where you're coming from today. In my case, it's from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to encourage our delegates to use the chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen. We encourage you to share your own research, links or thoughts on the session topics. When we get to Q&A, you can either write your question in the Q&A tab or virtually raise your hand, and we will bring you into the session with video and audio when appropriate. Please don't write your questions in the chat feature. The chat feature is where if you need instant support, you can contact our events team or for tech support. Today overall is about the ambition of non-state actors, and this session is about Scope 3 emissions. So you may have heard my pitch for this a few minutes ago, but Scope 1 emissions are those that take place within the boundaries of a facility or a business. Scope 2 emissions are from the generation of electricity consumed by you or your business. And Scope 3 emissions are everything else. Upstream emissions from the production of the materials and inputs other than electricity that go into your operations, but also the downstream emissions by customers or intermediate parties from the use of the products and services that you provide them. So it's a very big topic. There's a lot bound up in it. It can feel a bit overwhelming, a bit confusing, a bit inchoate. We're going to try and go deeper on slices of this topic rather than address everything at once. For instance, we're probably not going to spend a lot of time talking about emissions offsets, although those are often an important component of business plans for addressing their Scope 3 emissions. We're going to be looking at this issue through the lenses of the expertise and the sectors closest to our speakers today. So I'm going to introduce each of our speakers. One by one, they're going to give some opening remarks. We're going to get into some Q&A pretty quickly, and please start firing your questions through as early as you like. So first up, we're going to hear from Dr. Suzanne Etty, who is the Environmental Impact Specialist at Intrepid Travel, which is a carbon neutral and B Corp certified travel company. Suzanne leads Intrepid's climate action work, including carbon performance, reporting and transitioning the business to the low carbon economy. She's got over 15 years of experience in this area, in this and previous roles, and is committed to helping make travel better for everyone while simultaneously taking care of our planet. Welcome, Suzanne.
Welcome, and thank you very much, Tennant. I live on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I like also to pay my respect and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this meeting takes place, and also pay respect to elders both past and present. And as we share today our knowledge, teaching and practices, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. As you heard, I work for Intrepid Travel, which is the world leader in sustainable experience-rich travel, and has been taking travelers to discover the world's most amazing places for more than 30 years. The company offers more than 800 trips on every continent. And in 2018, the carbon neutral business became the world's largest company to be certified B Corp and joining a growing community of businesses looking beyond the bottom line. In the travel world, Intrepid Travel became actually the first tour operator with a science-based target initiative, verified emission reduction target for 1.5 degree future last year. And this showing how travel companies can actually have a measurable impact. There's actually currently no sector-specific guidance for our sector due to the diversity of the tourism sector, because it's spanning accommodation, destination, tour operators, to mention a few. Under SBTI, we actually needed to assess our Scope 3 emissions. And as Tannen said, these are all other indirect emissions across our company's value chain, and set a Scope 3 target in addition to Scope 1 and 2. For us, Scope 3 emissions include, for example, the business travel of staff, but also employee commuting, but transports like cruise ships and vans on our trips, or flights within our itineraries, but also brochures. One of the biggest challenges that we have is that we are all really in a supply chain together and are dependent on one another to move forwards. As I mentioned, the travel supply chains are particularly complex. There's no one-size-fits-all solutions. To reduce the greenhouse gas intensity on our trips, we also really rely on our suppliers, like the accommodation where we stay and the transport providers, to decarbonize. From a data point, we follow the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and we're gathering our data to inform a bottom-up approach. And that really means that we, for example, for our trips, aggregate activity-specific data across our transport, accommodation, and waste, which is highly detailed and accurate, but it's also very time-consuming and presents, therefore, also a challenge. To the point of a supplier partnership, as I said, we're all in it together. Climate change is a shared problem, and climate action is most effective if there's effective collaboration and sharing of knowledge. And that's why last year, our advocacy project was really about adding value that not just value to create for us, but rather the value that we could create for the wider industry, and in turn also for our planet. And for that reason, I actually authored a 10-step quick start guide to decarbonize your travel business, to provide that low barrier for other travel companies to get started on their carbon journey. Handing over to you, Tannen.
Thanks, Suzanne. So we're next going to hear introductory remarks from Nick Palousis. Nick is the CEO and founder of 2xe, an Australian engineering and strategy consulting firm that works with industries all over Australia to establish and manage net zero emissions programs. He also has over 15 years of experience. I'm feeling almost junior, which is a nice change, working with businesses to implement strategic approaches to energy management across a broad range of industrial and commercial assets and industry sectors. I'm looking forward to some of this experience. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you very much, Tannen, and I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that I'm presenting on today, which is the Kaurna people here in Adelaide. I guess my thread of opening remarks are a bit probably could say high level for a Tuesday. I'd like to talk about the strategic value of Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. So over the last maybe 5 to 10 years working with businesses on emissions reduction inventories and now net zero emission strategies, I've noticed that Scope 3 emissions is almost considered like the third drawer in your kitchen, where Scope 1 and 2 emissions are considered like the most important emission sources to address. Yet Scope 3 emissions is this kind of jumble drawer of other emission sources that you don't have direct control over, and therefore you might account for some of it, but isn't really your problem because you don't have direct control over it. I think that's the wrong way to go about things, and I guess to sort of explain why. Scope 3 emissions represents your entire value chain and essentially the entire value chain that you sit within as a business. So it's probably the most important scope in your business's inventory because it represents your entire reason for being as a business, where you sit in that value chain. So when it comes to emissions reduction opportunities, it's probably important to sort of reframe how you approach Scope 3 emissions in a way that's a bit different to the other scopes. So if you think about Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions associated with the direct control of your operations, emissions reduction opportunities are very much focused on either efficiencies, doing less of something or using less of something, or about, fuel switching or generation switching, right? When it comes to scope 3 emissions, however, when you dig a bit deeper, it starts to force questions about what, why, and how you buy something upstream, in the supply chain, and what, how, and why you sell something, products and services downstream. When you start delving into those questions, it no longer becomes it's not really an efficiency or a fuel switching or a source switching exercise. It becomes almost a strategic endeavor where you start to think about, well, what are the risks to my supply chain? How might climate change, implicate those risks and/or opportunities? How might this create an opportunity for us to rethink how we manufacture something or use something? And the same on the customer side. What might this mean as far as how our customers use our product or use our service? How do we turn that climate or carbon exposure into an opportunity to innovate, to create new products, new services, new ways of doing things? Now, what I've noticed, I guess, over the last maybe 18 months, some of the clients that we work with, they've kind of mastered scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. It's kind of we know what we're doing there now. It's just a matter of time before we get things nailed there. Scope 3 emissions now is like, okay, what does all this actually mean? And a number of our clients are now starting to go a little bit deeper in that journey and then go, okay, what does it mean as far as new product services we can sell? What does that mean as far as the packaging we use, and how do we innovate a better way of doing things upstream there? So some examples are, if you look at what IKEA is doing, a client we work with here in Australia, the Australian operations, they've been on this journey for the last couple of years in terms of looking at, well, how do we use our picture on scope 3 emissions as a way to rethink how we manufacture our product, where it gets manufactured, in China versus here in Australia potentially. How do we look at how we integrate circular economy with net zero emissions in a tighter way to kind of have closed loop manufacturing opportunities? And also, if you look at what they've done around engaging their global supply chain on PPAs, because they realize there's a strategic risk that their supply chain is exposed to with respect to carbon emissions, and therefore getting them onto renewably generated PPAs. Another example is if you look at the wine industry, and they're now rethinking what it means to package a bottle of wine. Do they look at glass bottles, but given that's carbon intensive, do they move towards plastic bottles, and what does that mean as far as quality is concerned, and how do they come up with better ways of doing things there? So there's some movement now, I think, where businesses are now no longer considering scope 3 emissions as just this optional extra that they just have to account to, and are now unpacking that and going, what strategic value does scope 3 emissions have? What kind of opportunities does it open up for us as far as new product services and new ways of thinking about a supply chain is concerned? So just some opening thoughts there, but I'm hoping that those opening points sort of invoke some discussion and questions from delegates. So over to you, Tennant.
Sorry, everyone. We're just having some technical difficulties. What I might do is, if I can please introduce George onto stage. George, if you don't mind, I'll get you to start your introduction, and I'll get Tennant back online.
And if I could just get on the chat, if you can hear me correctly, I would. I can see some people nodding on the backstage, so that's perfectly fine. I'm still going to thank Tennant for what I'm sure was a lovely introduction. I hope that's fine. My name is Jorge Chapa, Head of Market Transformation at the Green Building Council of Australia. Who do not know who we are, the Green Building Council of Australia is an industry association dedicated to the sustainable transformation of the built environment. The organization itself came out of the Sydney Olympics. If you recall, they were the first Green Olympics. And since then, we've been doing a number of activities. The organization essentially has a series of activities to change how buildings are built to deliver healthier, resilient, and more positive places for people and nature. In a nutshell, we have 4 key areas of activity. We do advocacy, we do collaboration, we do a lot of education to hundreds or thousands of individuals, and of course we run a rating system called Green Star, which you may know if you're in the building environment sector. Victor, I can still hear you on your end. If that's okay, would you mind? There we go. Perfect. Thank you very much. Muted. If anyone can chat to Victor, that would be great. The thing that I'm going to be talking about is essentially what does Scope 3 mean in a building? Because Scope 3 emissions are actually quite interesting when it comes to the environment. In fact, in a building, a significant portion of Scope 3 emissions are the day the building opens, right? There's a lot of decisions that happen in the construction building that impact how many emissions that building will have over its lifetime, but there's also a significant amount that are enabled now. Great, excellent. So what that means, of course, is that we need to think about types of emissions in the built environment that we have control and influence over. And the building sector has actually been doing a fair bit of work to come up with a line definition of what that looks like, both for new buildings and existing buildings. And one of the challenges, no matter how you frame it, is the extent of Scope 3 is so significant that it is easy to blur a lot of decisions into it and not understand what aspects you have control over and what aspects you have influence over. And I think what was very illustrative about understanding that you can classify your Scope 3 emissions in different buckets. There are the emissions that you have some control over, that you have a fair amount of control over. So let's call these the decisions that you make about the materials that you choose. There are emissions that you have some influence over. You, at a certain point, if you're going to be using concrete, there's a limitation to how much lower carbon that concrete can be. And there's also emissions that you can significantly address that are not yours, but you have a lot of power. An example of that would be gas consumption in apartment buildings. Ultimately, those are Scope 3 emissions, but the decision to install the enabling infrastructure is very simply a building level decision. When you consider all of those things, the bit that we tend to focus on buckets of the things that we're looking at. We have a reasonably small definition of the things that you have to be worried about in the built environment when it's Scope 3 emissions. We've actually managed to get the industry to align around a lot of those emissions, and that's immensely helpful to make sure that to make the change as quickly as we can in the big areas of impact that we can have. So with that out of the way, I look forward to the discussion in a few seconds on the question and answer, and I'm hoping I can pass it on to Tennant and that we can hear him now. So Tennant.
Yes, you can. My microphone got unplugged for a minute. So thanks, Jorge, and we will hear finally from Peter Shelley, who is the sustainability manager for energy and carbon at Australia Post and has been since 2013. His extensive experience includes managing the annual Carbon Disclosure Project reporting for Australia Post, carbon performance, including development of science-based targets and obtaining certification via Climate Active, and many more initiatives. So, Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Tennant, and welcome. First of all, I wish to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners of the land on which I'm presenting today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Thanks for the introduction, and today I wish to give you an insight into the emissions reduction approach at Australia Post, including the increased importance of Scope 3 and the opportunities that brings. So just a little bit of a context. In June 2021, Australia Post announced the approval of our new science-based target, which is a 15% reduction in Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by 2025 off our 2019 baseline. And we're pleased that we're one of only 16 companies in Australia with an approved target, noting that Intrepid Travel, part of the panel, are also one of the members. So the updated approach, it was really in contrast to what happened previously, where we had a 25% reduction in Scope 1 and 2 emissions, which has been alluded to earlier in the panel, was historically the focus. And through that program, we were able to reduce our emissions by 100,000 tonnes, which is the equivalent of removing 41,000 passenger vehicles off the road. For highlight for me, included the reduction in electricity of around 25%, which brought both commercial and environmental benefits. So we were able to implement this program and deliver commercial returns, which was well received. So moving on, with our new target, incorporating Scope 3, the recognition that actually that was about 70% of our total emissions. So clearly there was a large part of the pie that we were missing out on. And in fact, for Australia Post, that brought a whole new set of impacts. Just to put that into context, the two primary focus areas for us initially are air freight emissions. So you may have seen we have dedicated planes that are used to move our parcel and mail products across the country, which are the vehicles being owned by Qantas, but obviously we're the ones that control what gets put onto the vehicles. And our subcontracted road transport, which is around 30% of our emissions, but cuts across over 2,000 different relationships. So we see we've got a large concentration for our air freight, but a huge range of suppliers that we deal with on our road transport. And for me, this brings both a greater opportunity for us to share our learnings from our own fleet of 11,000 vehicles, and for us to pass those through to the managers of services to us, who are equally going to be faced with some of these new horizons. So a good example of this is for us to try and look through how we future-proof new technology, such as using electric trucks, and recent improvements that we've made in terms of increasing the size of our trailer configurations, so that we're now able to improve productivity by a third for some of the movements that occur up the highways. Finally, I just wanted to touch on an area that Nick alluded to, that really for us, we've seen a greater alignment with our approach with our customers. Increasingly, they're asking us questions about, well, what is the carbon impact of the services that we provide to them, which we manage through our carbon calculator, which we've developed across about 70 different products. And we see through that, first of all, the customers ask us, well, what is the impact? And then, well, is there anything that I can do about it? And the first example that I'd provide to that is, simply the customers choosing a service where we have a slower delivery option, that actually reduces the carbon impact when compared to a faster express post or sort of immediate courier, where we either utilize vehicles just for a single transaction, or where the items get moved on air freight, as that's the only alternative that will meet the SLAs and the delivery expectations of both the end customer as well as our customer. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully we can continue this discussion.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks all of our speakers so far. So there are some vibrant questions coming through in the Q&A field, thick and fast. We're going to get to as many of them as we can in the next 25 minutes, but I'd just pose a quick question to each of our panelists, which is, there's a lot of things that you could be focusing on in the Scope 3 emissions space, upstream, downstream, particular opportunities. What's your top one or two in your context that you work on at the moment that you feel like you can make the biggest difference on with your efforts in the near term? And Nick, feel free to pick one of the sectors that you've worked with in that regard, but maybe starting with Suzanne.
Yeah, thank you, Tenan. Yeah, that's a really good question. Maybe I pick two. One is around offices, because our Scope 3 emission targets, we have physical intensity targets for offices and also for our trips. So on our offices, it's really around looking at our business travel and employee commuting, so ensuring that our offices are in close proximity, say, to public transport hubs, which we have here in Melbourne, but it's also around ensuring this is happening across the world, and business travel is definitely, from our offices, a big Scope 3 contributor. From a trip perspective, it's really around looking at actually the development of our trips, and reviewing our existing trips. So we're currently reviewing our top 50 trips and looking at the flights within the trips, and if we can actually remove those trips and replace them with high-speed train journeys, for example, and we're planning to do this by 2022. So this is just giving you one example what we are kind of looking at Scope 3 emissions within our trips.
Thanks, Suzanne. Nick. You're still muted, Nick. The motto of 2020-21.
There we go. I'm rarely muted as well. I tend to talk the leaves off a tree, so apologies. So that's a very simple question. I think a very hard one as well. So I think my top, I'd probably say my top two. I think the easiest one to get moving on is waste for most organisations. Eliminating waste to landfill. Very clear. You know, there's a lot of,
because material efficiency is carbon efficiency.
Ticks a lot of boxes, and it's visible, it's tactile, so staff understand it. You do it at home, so you can do it at work. And there's that good link between circular economy and net zero emissions, right? That's the problem with net zero. With net zero emissions, it's super exciting and transformative, but it can often be not particularly visible or not particularly exciting unless you see a solar panel or a battery or a Tesla flying around or whatever it is. So I think waste is probably the first one. The second one is extremely hard, but this is where I think the likes of, say, Suzanne and Peter, they're in their respective organisations fronting this up, which I think is really important, is engagement with the customer. If you can nail the customer on this, it creates demand. I see a lot of businesses now looking up the chain towards packaging because they can kind of influence that, because they kind of have power over that because they're purchasing the packaging. So in theory, that would seem like a natural next step, and a lot of companies are looking at sustainable packaging solutions in that regard. But my opinion, if you're going to tackle Scope 3 head on in a way that makes massive change, you've got to start with engaging the customer to determine what opportunities are out there with the customer to change the way you buy, or so change the way you sell your product or service. So they're my top two.
Jorge.
I agree with everyone in that it's a great question, and picking like the top one is very, very difficult. So I'm going to cheat and say, for new buildings, I'll have one answer, and for existing buildings, I'll have a second answer, because they are genuinely distinct issues, right? There's a thing that cuts across all of them, but realistically speaking, they're very different. I would say that if you're looking at a new build, genuinely, very much without question, the issue of reducing your upfront carbon emissions, so the emissions manufacturing and construction. Lifetime in a building, it's about 15 to 20%, depending on how you calculate, but give or take, right? But they all happen by on the day that you open the building, those emissions are gone, right? So it's a huge amount of emissions that you can cancel out very quickly. The second one, which cuts across both, I would definitely say that we're spending a lot of time trying to make sure that we move buildings away from gas. And that's to be honest, from natural gas, and that's a genuine question. It's about, let's say, 5% of a building. Not a lot, but it's a lot of an infrastructure to move that gas from where to buildings that we need to change. And if you have gas, you cannot decarbonize the asset unquestionably, right? In Melbourne, it'll be closer to 20. In Queensland, it'll be like 10. So that's a lot. It's a lot of work to cook eggs with an open flame in your apartment, I just like to say. The third, I think the other aspect, the final aspect that we're starting to focus on a lot for existing buildings is definitely the case of tenant emissions. Large organizations are doing a lot of work at moving away from getting their power just from the grid. They're going and buying renewables off-site. That's great. That is expensive and difficult, though, for a small retailer, or expensive for, say, you or I. So, but these companies do have the processes and do have the capabilities to help tenants, especially the smaller ones, move up and procure renewables, and hopefully at a better rate than what they would if they just went to market themselves individually. So that's an aspect of things that we're looking at. I would say those are the three things that I would pick for.
Well, as a medium-sized tenant, I look forward to assistance. Peter Shelley, what's your top one or two picks?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I was hearing Nick and talking about waste, and that's certainly one of the focus areas for us. And then Suzanne was talking about business travel, and we've seen significant reduction on whether we could be able to continue that through the COVID period. But really, I think the two things that I thought were the most relevant for Australia Post are the work that we do with our strategic air freight partner. So how can we maximize the relationship with Qantas at the moment in terms of the types of aircraft that they provide, the way that we configure the vehicle. So we've done some work around cubing, and that sort of lends into the customer. How does the customer package the product? And if we can improve the way that the customer packages the product, that actually improves the density for us so that we can fit in more product into the space. Obviously recognizing that at this time we're talking about maximizing the space that we're likely to be using, rather than saying that we're actually going to remove that plane from circulation in the short term. And then furthermore, we're looking with the partnership around the type of fueling that occurs, and the move towards what in the industry is known as sustainable aviation fuel. And is this really, what are the opportunities that present to an organisation like Australia Post, where we're moving all across the country, and there may be particular legs that we can really focus on in the first term. So that's the first one. The second one is one which we've been doing work on for a period of time, but it's been really important, and that's around what we call modal switch. And really it's about, can we utilize our network in a different way so that we're able to get products moved by different transportation processes. So we had a great example historically where we were able to change the way that product was moved from Brisbane to Darwin, where it used to have a dedicated road trip, and that happened every day, every night. And through some clever engineering, we were able to move the product so that it could go from the other way around the country, and we actually went from Brisbane all the way down to Adelaide on the road, and then up to from Adelaide to Darwin on the rail. And in fact, that's been further enhanced over time, and we're now actually able to move product from Brisbane to Adelaide all the way on the train, and then get the same product to go up through the country. So that had a significant reduction, because that was just dedicated routes for that particular transport leg. And over time, we're looking at that increasingly around, can we switch for some of our road movements as well? Can historic air movements become road, or can they become rail as well? So this is a real focus area for us, and I suppose it's a little bit unique to us in the freight industry. But the learnings that we can have can then be replicated by some of our partners as well in terms of their choices. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Peter. Now, I'm going to pose a really curly one that Monica in the audience has asked. Given that there is a focus on Scope 3 emissions by business, can we envisage a time when Australia's total Scope 3 emissions will need to be accounted for as a part of our reporting and global obligations? And I'll give it like an individual business spin on that as well. How much pressure do you see for mandatory or really structured Scope 3 reporting at the business level compared to the sorts of obligations around Scope 1 and 2 that many have? So while people are deciding who wants to dive in there, I'll give a quick view on the global front, which is I don't think that there is going to be an obligation per se. I think that the Scope 1 focus of international UNFCCC accounting is here to stay, but something doesn't have to be mandatory to be extremely important as a way of understanding and working to affect the world. Scope 3 is important in the way that it draws our attention not just to what happens up and down the supply chain, but the way that interactions between the locus of control can make it harder to address or easier to address those emissions. But for Suzanne, Nick, Jorge and Peter, any of you want to jump in on either the global or the...
I can jump in on that one, Tennant. I was thinking of it in terms of the context of the science-based target, and because larger organisations are moving towards having science-based targets which incorporate Scope 3, in effect, you should be in a position where if you took the top 100 companies by their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then you had some way of consolidating those up, we could clearly get a picture of what the Scope 3 emissions impact were as a whole, and use that as a proxy to get some much better data. And I know that we actually do that ourselves. We've actually done a bit of benchmarking to see which ones of the larger companies are reporting the size of the impact. And certainly, you won't be surprised. Companies like Wesfarmers have an enormous Scope 3 impact, as well as, the miners and organizations like that, which they're now starting to report on. So we can really start to see the scale of this. So I think that whilst it may not be legislated in the short term, there's definitely ways that you can get better access to that information. And certainly that comes across to us at Australia Post, where our customers are asking us for the carbon impacts. And that includes the services all the way, Scope 1, 2 and 3. Our carbon calculator includes all of those. So we get a good representation of the impacts of those services.
Yeah.
Nick here, I'd agree with that, exactly what Peter said. I think also, as it relates to Science-Based Targets Initiative and also Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, that's putting a lot of pressure now on businesses now. Carbon risk, which will include Scope 3 emissions as well. I don't know whether there's a word of it being sort of mandated or obligated, from an official kind of standpoint. I mean, there are pros and cons to all that kind of thing, but I think expected, yeah, absolutely, it will be expected.
Yeah.
With that, I don't see a situation. We're not going to see businesses mandate Scope 3 emissions. Full stop. It's going to be something that's going to be expected as part of your corporate reporting. If it already partly is, to be honest, the good ones already.
Mm-hmm.
So there's another question that is posed in different ways by a couple of audience members, which is about Scope 3 is a complex thing to talk about. What are successful ways into that issue for smaller businesses who may be still getting up to speed on Scope 1 and Scope 2? What's a way of raising the visibility of that issue, and in a way that is tangible and they can do something about?
Yeah, so Nick here. I guess the bit of advice I'd give there is you start with the Scope 3 emission source that is most important to your business continuity. So whether that's packaging, whether that's a product, whether that's people driving to work, whether that's how your customers use your product or your service, you'd start with the very thing in your value chain that is critical to your business existing. and you start with that. I mean, I'd suggest you go straight to that if I was being ambitious. If you want to start with something easy, you'd start with something like waste, where you can get data, quickly and start to sort of track that. I would hazard against trying to build an entire Scope 3 emissions inventory off the bat, because it takes time and you don't want to wear yourself out or wear others out at the same time. If you're ambitious enough to do so, I'd keep it very targeted towards either the thing you can affect in the short term or the thing that matters most to your value chain for your organization.
Very good. I note we've got less than 10 minutes left. Suzanne, you had an intervention. Go for it.
No intervention, but I thought building on what Nick was saying is maybe bringing also the advocacy part in that company like us have, is actually sharing and open sourcing our methodology to actually enable those smaller businesses to get on the journey, because it can be really overwhelming. And I speak certainly for the tourism sector here. It's just like many companies are still struggling with the measuring of emissions from Scope 1 and 2. So Scope 3 is this other kind of unknown. So what I really always encourage is like to reach out to join collectives. So in the tourism sector, we have the Tourism Declares a Climate Emergency collective, which brings business together of all sizes. And it's about working together, sharing knowledge, enabling each others to really kind of move forward on the climate journey. So that's maybe also something to really consider. How can you work with others together and learn from them?
So I've got a curly one that I think is going to be relevant in different ways for every sector represented, which is for some deep decarbonisation options in Scope 3, as in Scope 1, there is a cost premium involved, certainly at this point in time, over the high emitting alternative. So how much demand is visible at the moment for specifically clean materials, inputs, products and services, and how is that trending over time? Do you see positive signs there, or what's the story, given that not universal and not fixed for all time, but often relevant cost premium? Jorge, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'll go into it, because this was a challenge that we had for a long time when it came to embodied carbon in buildings, right? The way that we described the problem was the building stands up the same way there is a low carbon material or a high carbon material, right? Ultimately, no, you don't walk into a building and look at it and go, wow, this is a gorgeous building, so I'd love to be here, except that the embodied carbon of concrete used during its development was incredibly high. That conversation does not happen right now. So that's a question that we've been looking at a lot in terms of what are the drivers for essentially generating demand for people to look at low carbon materials. So we've the building industry, because of the work that it's been doing and it's been growing in the space over time, they create a mechanism to start valuing that. The rating system that we run, for example, requires buildings to do work in that space. Every sector will have that. I think though ultimately what's happening is there's an expectation that's slowly filtering down from different levels of governance, right? And when I say governance, I don't mean government, I mean the finance piece, I mean the pressure bits, I mean the social license to operate. Eventually, or as time goes on, and as I'm sure everyone here that's spoken about their case studies, they always start with one or two, but one or two becomes everything very quickly. And so what you're seeing, or what we're seeing, is that the demand for lower embodied carbon materials, for example, in the building sector, went from non-existent 3 years ago to the only thing the industry is talking about when it comes to sustainability and carbon emissions. And that speed is what's obviously driving the shift in how people look at it. We were talking to a big construction company, big manufacturing company, cement company, and they essentially said that they went from not even having literature on embodied carbon content of their products to getting asked for carbon neutral products in the span of 2 years, right? That's how quickly they went from it. And that just shows that, yes, it's a challenge right now. Yes, it's more expensive right now, but that demand is generating its own cycle to bring the price down, which is really what's going to happen.
Yeah. We say all it takes is a carbon price, Tanner. We nailed it.
Well, there's a few of those around the world, and I will do a little promo. AI Group has today released a major report on carbon border adjustment mechanisms, with a particular focus on the European Union one, which, if you're game for 70 pages of CBAM action, will lay out the impact that that policy may have up and down supply chains around the world, reaching into Australia.
Perfect lunch reading for people.
Well, yes. Lunchtime, bedtime, it's good for all times. That report at aigroup.com.au. The next 2 volumes of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's major update, the 6th assessment report of the state of climate science, are going to be relevant to these issues too. And the 3rd volume, which I reviewed a chunk of a little while back, has got some terrific stuff on not only the technical options for cutting emissions in these that are embodied in these critical materials, but a lot of creative thinking about policy mechanisms of different sort to drive demand for them. So look out for that in March if you've got any big report reading left in you by that time. Now, before we move to closing statements, any other thoughts on the state of demand for clean products and materials in respective sectors? Yep, go for it, Suzanne.
I'm happy to share from a tourism perspective. So we are definitely seeing a trend that more customers want to use the train instead of flying, and minimizing just general their air travel. And that's maybe more a shift of mindset that we definitely see in Europe, a lot harder here in Australia to do. But that's really kind of what we are also responding to, is to kind of, as I mentioned earlier, to review our top 50 trips for internal flights, but it's also to offer more domestic products and more hiking and cycling trips, which inherent, of course, have already a much lower carbon footprint. And that's really what we are seeing from a customer perspective.
Thanks, Suzanne. Now, there's a question in the chat that if anybody's got a great response to it, now is definitely the time to give it before we wrap up, which is there something better that we could call Scope 3 emissions? Because it's a bit of an off-putting bit of jargon. Nick, what's the solution?
Oh, well, a solution, maybe not the solution, but a solution might be value chain emissions.
Yeah,
I was thinking the same thing.
Great minds, Peter. Great minds and all that. Yeah, awesome.
Well, we're at 1 minute to go. We've solved at least one of the most pressing problems in the world of Scope 3 emissions. It shouldn't be the world of Scope 3 emissions anymore. I'd like to thank all of you for joining this session, all of our speakers for sharing their wisdom. I think that one of the critical things that we've covered in it is the extent to which focusing on Scope 3 or value chain emissions and working with your suppliers and your customers can unlock better ways to control and reduce and eliminate those emissions than everybody just focusing within their own direct locus of control. There is greater value to be created across a value chain by thinking about these issues. In a moment, you're going to be automatically moved to the next session to wrap up before we head to a break. Thanks to all of you and see you soon.
Thank you, Tim.
Okay.